Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me, and happy Black History Month. You know, in America, this time of year, we take a little time out to make sure that we mention and acknowledge some of the great Black Americans that have contributed to the culture, to the prosperity, to the innovation that America enjoys as a nation. You know, during the year, in most history classes, you don't get an opportunity to hear about some of these great Black Americans. And so we take the time out in February to make sure that we talk about them. Now, I'm a proponent of the idea that Black history is American history and that every day is Black history. But as a nation, we have this time set aside specifically to honor those great Black Americans and to make sure that we continue to talk about what they've contributed to in this country. And so, in honor of Black History Month, on this episode, we're still talking about the language of justice, but we're going to talk about race and ethnicity all month long. That's going to be our topic for Black History Month, race and ethnicity, when we talk about justice as people who are fighting and advocating for justice in various spaces. You know me, this is environmental justice. That's what I'm concerned about. But no matter what you're fighting for, we have to make sure our language, the way we talk about these things, communicates what needs to be communicated. And we need to make sure that we're very clear about what we're talking about and who we're talking about. And so I know already to even talk about race and ethnicity elicits strong emotions and strong reactions from all kinds of people, right? They'll say things like, we're all one race, right? We're all one race. Why are you dividing us with your racial talk? You know, some might say, well, why are you making that about race? It's not about race. You know, whatever you're talking about, environmental justice, criminal justice, any kind of justice, it's not about race. Don't make it about race. Or you might get this one. That was an issue in the past, right? We had those issues back then. But we're beyond that. We've moved past that. That's not an issue anymore. Race, you know, the idea that people are suffering due to race is not a thing anymore. And so you might hear that. So if you're fighting for justice, if you're pushing for equity in any arena, in any space, I know you've heard some form of those types of pushbacks, right? I mean, the idea that any attempt to achieve justice could be viewed as outdated or even reverse racism. I've heard that before too. Reverse racism. You're creating injustice for other people while you fight for justice for some people. It doesn't make sense to me, but I've heard that before too. And the idea that you could be harming others when you're just fighting for justice for everybody just doesn't seem to make any sense to me. And so we have to be careful, right? We have to be careful. We don't want to get bullied or coerced into thinking that there's something wrong with us, right? For advocating for specific racial groups, specific ethnic groups, specific marginalized groups, right? Wherever we are, wherever we live, we know that past policies, past actions have disproportionately harmed specific groups of people. And so it's on us as the advocates, as the activists, as the researchers, as the teachers, as the community group leaders, to make sure we are very clear about who these people are and what was done to them. That's what it means to fight for justice. We have to be clear about that. So no matter who we're talking about, what we're talking about, we need to be very clear when we fight for change. We can't fall back on these euphemisms or these acronyms to try to hide and conceal who is being unjustly, disproportionately impacted by what's happening in our societies. We need to make sure that our language, specifically around race and ethnicity, is clear, very, very clear. And so let's just talk about it just for a little bit on this episode. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm Dr. Joseph. Thank you for listening. And in honor of Black History Month on this episode and throughout the month, we're going to be talking about race and ethnicity when we talk about the language of justice, how we talk about justice. And so just to make sure everybody's clear, I live in the United States of America. And so most of my references and most of my experiences when it comes to race and ethnicity is from me growing up in the United States. I would consider myself a Black American. My parents are from Haiti. They came over to the United States before I was born, and I was born here. And so here in America. And so all of my experiences, all of my perceptions and viewpoints when it comes to race and ethnicity come from that experience. So if you're from somewhere else around the world, I know there's listeners all around the world. Think about how this plays out where you live, what you've experienced, what you've seen, what you've heard, what you know when it comes to race and ethnicity in your particular context. Because in America, it's interesting. And so before we even start talking about it and diving in, let's get down to the basics. So what is race, right? What is ethnicity? We need some clear definitions and understanding in front of us before we start to jump into what's going on when we talk about it. So, what is race? The American Psychological Association says that race is the social construction and categorization of people based on perceived shared physical traits that result in the maintenance of a socio-political hierarchy. That's a really fancy definition. I'm going to say it one more time, or you can rewind it, whatever you want to do. Listen to this again. The social construction and categorization of people based on perceived shared physical traits that result in the maintenance of a socio-political hierarchy. We got to break that down just a little bit more because there's a lot in that definition that you have to understand before we start talking about race. So the first thing is the social construction. It is socially constructed. People in society have decided that this is how we're going to identify and categorize the people that are here. They deliberately chose to do that. There was nothing out there that suggests that you needed to. They just chose to. They looked at people and they looked at other people and they didn't look the same. And so the people, at least in America when it was founded, looked at those people and they said, we're going to put you in this category based on how you look. And we're going to put you in that category based on how you look. And those perceived physical traits are basically skin color. That was the categorization, right? And so when people from England came to America and settled, they were all from Europe. They brought slaves from Africa, from the Caribbean nations, to do free work to build the country. And they brought people who did not look like them to do that forced slave labor. And then they looked at them and said, because of your physical traits, i.e., your skin color, we're going to put you lower on the hierarchy than us who came and settled in this land. And so that's how that happened. And I imagine that happens in lots of countries around the world. The larger, more dominant, more powerful group decides who gets to be in which category and where they would fall on that hierarchy. And so in America, it's white, it's non-white, but back then it was black, and white was higher than black. And it was very simple, and people had a place in society, and they knew what that place was. Some on top, the rest on the bottom. And that's how race came about. And so when you look on your forms and they ask you to identify your race, those categories were developed by our society, by the dominant people in our society, to make sure people knew what place they should be in and to literally put yourself in your place by selecting how you would identify yourself based on your skin color. That's it. Nothing else. And of course, people try to justify their categories with ridiculous theories and ridiculous ideas about the historical nature of people's physical characteristics. It's not even worth talking about. Because in the end, you looked at a person and you saw their skin color and you said, you belong in that category and you should be treated that way. And because you are in this category, we can treat you this way. And it was different because of this social construction of race. And in America, it's all centered around being white, around whiteness. And what's interesting about that is there's some people who are considered white now who weren't always considered to be white. They just weren't. Right? So people from Europe pretty much were always white. People from, Scandinavian countries come over. Yeah, well, you're white. We'll put you in the white category. But people from Ireland, not quite. Jewish people who came over, I don't think so. Some people still don't think so. Other kind of South American countries, people with fairer skin, longer hair. I'm not quite sure if you get to be in our category. And so over time, the people who are included in the dominant group called white expanded, and the benefits and the privileges that came along with that reached to them as well. And so now in 2024, you have white representing a group that's much larger than it initially did when it was first constructed, because it was done by people. And it was done for various reasons. I don't have all the information because I'm not a race and ethnicity scholar with that kind of training. But you can just see the disparities. You can see the differences in how people are treated based on race, based on how they look. It's real clear. And what's important to know about race is that the reason it was constructed was to create the hierarchy. That's why it exists. It doesn't exist to celebrate the differences or to recognize the diversity of a community or to blend ideas and thoughts together to make a better society. That's not why we have these racial categories. Because the categories themselves, there's nothing wrong with a category. We're different. We're all made differently. There's nothing wrong with identifying differently with who we are and where we're from. It's no big deal, but the reason that race is an issue is because of the reasons why it was constructed. It was constructed specifically to generate a hierarchy so that we could justify treating one group better than everyone else, and to justify the way we would brutalize other groups of people. And that's why it was done. So when people came over to America and there were indigenous people already here, they're not like us. We'll treat them differently and worse off than we treat anybody else who looks like us. We bring slaves over. We mistreat them. We treat them brutally and harm them and disrupt and disintegrate their families. They're not like us. And as we go on through history, the social construction is fought to be maintained. It's never dismantled. It's never reimagined in a way that would be helpful for everyone to help us all live peacefully in society. It's always there to create the hierarchy. And that's the problem with race. And so for all of my friends out there, you're fighting for justice, you're fighting for equity, you're fighting to remove disparities and disproportionate impacts and all these issues, it's important to be very clear about who is experiencing them. Be clear. If we're talking about race, we're talking about race. We're talking about Black people who are dealing with certain types of issues of injustice. We're talking about Indigenous people who are dealing with certain types of injustice. We're talking about what the census would call Asian American or Pacific Islander people who are dealing with issues of injustice. We're talking about all of these different groups of people. And it's not a coincidence. It is not by happenstance that the disproportionate impacts fall on these other communities, these other quote unquote races, and not on those who would be considered white. And furthermore, another issue I have, this is a big problem for me. When we talk about race, everything is centered around white. White becomes almost like the default, and every other quote unquote race is othered, right? You're white or you're quote non-white. You're white or you're a person of color. You're white or you're, the acronym now is BIPOC. Like, we have all of these constructions of people, but in every construction, white is always at the top and everything else is under and almost grouped together into one other race. It's like there's white and there's other. That's not how that should go. There can be white and black and yellow and red, and we can have different. If we're going to do a color coding system, then let's do a full color coding system. Make them all the same and put them on equal footing, and let's just talk about everybody the way that they are. If we're going to have that kind of construction and categorization. But that's not why. We have it so that we can clearly and definitively say this group, in America is white, is far superior than any other group. And so your goal is to get into that white group. That's where the privileges and the benefits are. Get into that white neighborhood, that white school, that white organization, that white company. That's where the benefits are. All the others are not as highly regarded, not as important, not as well funded, not as well respected, not as well treated. And as a result, they deal with disproportionate impacts to everything that happens. And so for me in the environmental space, I'm thinking about water quality and air quality and how we manage waste and how we deal with trash and how we construct our cities and our neighborhoods and our communities. Where are the parks? Where are the supermarkets? Where are the places to go play? And where are the places to go, enjoy life? That's an issue because this social construction of race is there solely to maintain the hierarchy. And so all of my justice-minded people, be clear about that. Be very clear. That is what's happening. So when I talk about Cancer Alley, I don't want to say that there are people of color disproportionately impacted by large numbers of petrochemical facilities along the Mississippi River in Louisiana. I don't want to say that. I want to say that Black Americans are being disproportionately impacted. If we're talking about indigenous and tribal nations, use the actual name of the people who are being harmed. Indigenous people are dealing with A, B, and C. If we're talking about an Arab American community, we're talking about an Asian American community. Even those categories might be too big, too broad. I mean, how big is Asia? Asia is a continent. Who else does that? How do we put a whole continent in one category? I mean, we don't do that here. There's not an American who is from, North America, South America, Central America is American. No, we don't do that. it's white and black and this and that. But we take Asian, and I know why, because back when people from Asia were coming to America, they were so marginalized and so disenfranchised that they grouped together to try and have a little bit of influence on how their lives were going to be. So they came together and formed this group called Asian American, so they could have a little more influence and impact in the discussions. And I understand it. It makes complete sense. But let's be honest, that category is just too big and it's too expansive. Black. You can call me black. That's fine. My skin is darker than yours. I'm black. But you make it seem like every black person is the same kind of person, the same ideas, the same view of the world, the same. We're not the same. And that's because we're from different places. Which goes to the next point I wanted to make, which is, what is ethnicity? What is ethnicity? Going back to the American Psychological Association, they say ethnicity is a characterization of people based on having a shared culture related to common ancestry and shared history. That's a better way to categorize people than by race. I just have to tell you, it's just a much better way to do it. Think about people in terms of having a shared culture, same values, the way they dress, the way they eat, the way they talk, what they believe in, what's important to them, music, food. This is the way that you should categorize people. This is a more organic, more effective, more appropriate way of understanding who is who than this whole race thing with the colors. And so now, if we talk about ethnicity, we can get more to the heart of who we're actually dealing with and who is actually being impacted by whatever we're dealing with. So, for instance, let's go back to Cancer Alley. We know that those areas where those plants and those facilities are in Cancer Alley are located in places that used to be plantations. Plantations that were owned and operated by plantation owners and ran by African slaves. And so now, generation after generation, as slavery was abolished and as Black people became free in the South, that land was taken over and turned over to those enslaved Africans, and their families inherited that land. They called it plantation country. Lots of sugar cane, lots of agricultural wealth was there. And then it was imposed upon by the government with these facilities. And so we know that those individuals, their shared history, their background is not Black, but it's actually the descendants of enslaved Africans. You know, in America, we try to use the phrase African American to distinguish people whose ancestors were enslaved Africans versus other Black people, quote unquote, Black people from around the world. And so that ethnicity, that group, is who we're talking about. Now, it gets challenging with the word African American because now people from Africa are migrating to America now with a different culture, different heritage than the descendants of enslaved Africans that are already here. But you know what? We can figure that out later. The point is, there's a difference. And that difference is important to know when you're talking and dealing with certain people. And so I like the ethnicity lens. And with that lens, there's no hierarchy involved because we all have our own shared values and cultures that we celebrate, that we appreciate, that make the country better because we're all able to express them as one nation. And that's the point. So instead of having white, Black, red, and yellow, you can have African, Korean, Chinese, Polish, German, French, Romanian, Guatemalan, Mexican, Canadian. Now we have real ethnicities, real places, and real people with real values that we can all appreciate and all enjoy. And when we start talking about justice, we can look through those lenses and then see people from more than just a skin color, more than just a physical trait that we can just point out in a picture and say, you're not like us, you get to be treated less than us. That's not how that goes. That's not how we should do things. And so I would encourage all of us, if we can, if it's possible, to think about ethnicity when we talk about justice. Justice for the descendants of enslaved Africans, African Americans, justice for people living in Koreatown and Chinatown and all these places that are neglected, and Indigenous Native American or Native Alaskan or specific ethnic groups that we can identify based on their culture, that we can then talk about in ways that are more uplifting, more appreciative, and more helpful for the rest of us than to fall back on these really just lazy racial categories. I mean, it really is lazy to say somebody's white or black or brown. Like, you don't even know what you're saying. You don't even know who you're talking to. What's a brown person? What's a black person? What's a white person anyway? What are these categories? And so I know we're not going to dismantle it overnight. We're not going to be able to just move to ethnicity from hearing this one episode, but hopefully you're thinking about it and considering it when you talk about justice, when you talk about a community, when you talk about a neighborhood that you're concerned about. Who are the people? What do they care about? What are they concerned about? What are their lives like? Where are they from? What do they believe in? What do they value? Who do they trust? What kind of food do they eat? Listen to the music. What language? What's that accent? Where's that accent from? Can you tell me where that accent came from? Like, these are the ways that we can think about others who aren't like us. And as we talk about justice, environmental justice, we can talk about it in ways that are helpful and that can actually cross borders and cross boundaries. Because now when I talk about African American neighborhoods, I can go from Louisiana to Alabama to Mississippi to New York to California with the same conversation, and we know what we're talking about. If I just say black, well, are you talking about the descendants of slaves? Are you talking about Haitians? Are you talking about Jamaicans? Are you talking about people from Nigeria who just came over? Are you talking about people from Ghana? I don't know what you're talking about when you say the word black. And so you can't even connect those people to the broader ethnic group that you're concerned about when you use the lazy racial categories. And so let's change how we talk about race and ethnicity when we talk about justice for the people who need it. Let's talk about who those people really are, what they're really about, and let's make sure that our advocacy is targeted and directly connected to the people we want to help and we want to serve. That's what I want to do. That's what I want to see happen. That's what we should be considering. We shouldn't fall back and be lazy and be complacent when it comes to directly addressing the ills in our society and the people who are disproportionately impacted by them. We should be very clear and very direct when we talk about race and ethnicity in the view of environmental and social and climate, criminal and education justice, all the justices. We need to be very clear in how we talk about it. Very clear. And that's our episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.